The billionaire's fiancé humiliated a maid at the gala, then one phone call changed everything. You don't belong in this room. Vanessa Whitmore's voice cut through the ballroom like glass breaking. She raised her glass of red wine, tilted it slowly over the maid's bowed head, and let it pour. 200 guests gasped. Cameras flashed. The maid, Grace Bennett, didn't move, didn't cry, didn't beg. She simply reached into her apron, pressed a button on her phone, and whispered 4 words that would destroy everything Vanessa thought she owned. Tell him it's confirmed. Nobody in that ballroom knew what was coming. Not even the groom. Welcome back, friends, to another story full of heartbreak, hope, and hard-earned justice. Tonight's story will make you angry, then make you cry, then make you believe in karma all over again. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, which country are you watching from tonight? Stay with us till the very end, because this twist you will not see coming. Grace Bennett had cleaned that ballroom 100 times. Tonight, she would leave it in handcuffs or in history. Grace Bennett was 26 years old, and she had learned a long time ago that dignity didn't pay rent. She worked 2 jobs in Charleston, South Carolina, mornings at a laundromat, nights as catering staff for Whitmore and Carrington Events, the company that handled the city's most extravagant parties. Tonight's event was the biggest of the year, the engagement gala for Nathaniel Carrington, heir to the Carrington Hotel Group, and his fiancée, Vanessa Whitmore, daughter of one of the wealthiest families on the East Coast. Grace had grown up poor, raised by her grandmother after her father, Arthur Bennett, died when she was 11. Her grandmother used to tell her stories about Arthur, how he'd once been a hotel man himself, how he'd helped build something great before life fell apart for their family. Grace never fully believed those stories. To her, they were just comforting bedtime tales from a grieving old woman. What mattered now was survival, rent, groceries, and the ache in her feet after a 12-hour shift. The Carrington Grand Ballroom glittered that night. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung from gold ceilings. Waiters in white gloves carried trays of champagne. String quartets played soft, elegant music while 300 of the wealthiest people in South Carolina mingled in silk and diamonds. Grace moved quietly among them, refilling glasses, clearing plates, keeping her head down the way she'd been trained. She wasn't invisible by accident. She'd learned that if she smiled too much, some of these people got uncomfortable. If she made eye contact too long, they complained to management. So she kept her eyes low and her voice softer than a whisper. Nathaniel Carrington noticed her anyway. He was 31, sharp-jawed, tired-eyed, a man who had inherited more money than he knew what to do with, but not the coldness that usually came with it. His father, Richard Carrington, had built the family's hotel empire from a single property his own father, Nathaniel's grandfather, had co-founded decades earlier. Nathaniel had grown up hearing his grandfather's old business partner mentioned only once, in hushed tones, like a mistake nobody wanted to talk about. He didn't know the man's name. He only knew there had been a falling out, and that the subject was forbidden at dinner. Nathaniel watched Grace refill a glass of water for an elderly guest, watched her patiently answer a rude question from a drunk businessman without a flicker of irritation on her face. There was something about her calm that unsettled him, not because it was weak, but because it wasn't. "You're good at this," he said quietly, catching her near the kitchen doors. Grace startled, nearly dropping her tray. "Sorry, sir. I didn't see you there." "Don't apologize," Nathaniel said. "I mean it. You're good at this job. Most people in this room couldn't survive one shift of it." Grace allowed herself a small, surprised smile, the first genuine one she'd shown all night. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know." Their conversation lasted less than 60 seconds. But Vanessa Whitmore, standing 30 feet away in a blood-red gown, saw all of it. Vanessa had been raised in a mansion outside Hilton Head, taught from childhood that certain people were born to lead and certain people were born to serve. Her mother often said, "Sweetheart, the poor aren't unlucky. They're simply lesser." Her father had built his real estate fortune by underpaying and overworking people exactly like Grace, and Vanessa had absorbed that lesson before she'd even learned to read. She crossed the room, heels clicking against marble like small gunshots. "Is there a problem here?" Vanessa asked, looping her arm possessively through Nathaniel's. "No problem," Nathaniel said. "Just complimenting the staff." Vanessa's eyes flicked over Grace like she was inspecting a stain on the carpet. "The staff," she repeated, "don't need compliments. They need to remember their place." Grace lowered her eyes again, the old, practiced motion. "Of course, ma'am. I apologize for the disruption." But Vanessa wasn't finished. She never was. "What's your name?" she asked, voice sweet and venomous at once. "Grace, ma'am." "Grace," Vanessa repeated, tasting the word like it amused her. "How fitting. You'll need plenty of it in a job like yours." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Vanessa's father, Marcus Whitmore, appeared beside them, clapping Nathaniel on the shoulder with the forced heartiness of a man closing a business deal disguised as a wedding. "Nathaniel, there's someone from the board I need you to meet." He led Nathaniel away, and just like that, Grace was alone with Vanessa. The moment his back was turned, Vanessa's smile vanished. "Listen to me carefully," she said, low enough that only Grace could hear. "This is my night. My family. My future husband. You will not humiliate me by making him waste his attention on the help. Do you understand?" Grace's hands trembled slightly around her tray, but her voice stayed even. "I understand, ma'am. I wasn't trying to." "I don't care what you were trying to do," Vanessa snapped. "I care what you did." She walked away before Grace could respond, leaving her standing there, humiliated, in front of no one and everyone at once. Grace excused herself to the kitchen hallway, pressed her back against the cool tile wall, and allowed herself 30 seconds, just 30 seconds, to breathe through the sting in her chest. She thought of her grandmother, now in a nursing home with declining health, whose bills Grace was barely keeping up with. She thought of her father's old stories, the ones about hotels and partnerships and betrayal, stories that had never once put a single dollar in her pocket. She wiped her eyes, straightened her apron, and walked back into the ballroom. The night was young. She had no idea it was about to get so much worse, or that a phone call, hours away, would change the rest of her life. Vanessa smiled for the cameras that night. She had no idea she was smiling next to the one person who could take everything away from her. The gala moved into its second hour, and the champagne flowed faster than the conversation. Nathaniel stood beside Vanessa as photographers captured the perfect couple, his smile polished from years of practice, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the kitchen doors where Grace had disappeared. He didn't understand why he couldn't stop thinking about her. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was something else, something closer to recognition. As if he'd met her before in a dream he couldn't quite remember. His grandmother, Eleanor Carrington, now 81 and rarely seen in public, had insisted on attending the gala despite her failing health. She sat near the back in a wheelchair, sharp-eyed and silent, watching the room with the quiet intensity of someone who had built an empire and buried most of the people who'd helped her do it. Eleanor watched Grace work. She watched the girl's face, her posture, the careful way she moved through the crowd. Something about her made Eleanor's chest tighten. "Bring me a water, dear," Eleanor said, catching Grace's arm gently as she passed. "Of course, ma'am." Grace fetched the water quickly, kneeling slightly to hand it over with both hands, an old habit of respect her grandmother had taught her. Eleanor studied her face. "What's your last name, sweetheart?" "Bennett, ma'am." Eleanor's hand froze around the glass. "Bennett," she repeated softly. "Was your father named Arthur?" Grace blinked, startled. "Yes, ma'am. How did you?" "Arthur Bennett," Eleanor whispered, almost to herself, eyes glistening. "My God." Before Grace could ask another question, one of the event coordinators rushed over, apologizing profusely to Eleanor for the delay in service and pulling Grace away to attend to another table. Grace looked back once, confused, as the old woman watched her go with an expression Grace couldn't read: grief, guilt, and something like hope all tangled together. Eleanor reached for her phone with shaking hands and made a call to her family's longtime attorney, a man named Walter Hayes, who had served the Carrington family legal affairs for 40 years. "Walter," she said quietly, "I need you to come to the gala tonight.
Now.
And bring the Bennett file." "Eleanor, it's nearly 9 at night, are you sure?" "I found her," Eleanor said, voice trembling. "I found Arthur's daughter." Across the ballroom, unaware of any of this, Vanessa was in her element. She stood at the center of a circle of admirers, recounting a story about a designer gown she'd flown to Milan to have custom fitted. Her friends laughed on cue, sipping champagne, feeding the performance she needed like oxygen. "Can you believe the nerve of some people?" Vanessa said, lowering her voice conspiratorially to her closest friend, Bridget. That maid earlier, Nathaniel was talking to her like she was some kind of equal. "It's disgusting, honestly. People need boundaries." Bridget, who privately found Vanessa exhausting but valued her family's social connections too much to say so, nodded along. "Some people just don't know their place." "Exactly," Vanessa said. "My mother always said wealth isn't just money, it's breeding. It's in the blood. You can't teach someone class if they weren't born with it." Nearby, overheard by no one important, or so she thought, Grace's coworker, an older waiter named Desmond who had worked events like this for 20 years, shook his head slowly. He'd seen women like Vanessa before. They always believed the ground beneath them was permanent. He'd also seen more than once in his career the ground shift. Grace, meanwhile, had been pulled into the back kitchen to help plate desserts, her mind still spinning from her strange exchange with the elderly woman. Arthur Bennett, her father's name, spoken by a stranger with tears in her eyes. It didn't make sense. Her father had been nobody, a quiet, broken man who worked odd jobs after some business failure he never discussed, who died of a heart attack when Grace was 11, leaving behind debts, not fortunes. She pushed the thought aside. She had trays to carry, feet that ached, and a grandmother's medical bills that wouldn't pay themselves. An hour later, she was assigned to bring a fresh round of drinks to the head table, where Vanessa now sat beside Nathaniel, laughing loudly at something her father had said. As Grace approached, balancing a tray of wine glasses, Vanessa turned and saw her, and something dark flickered behind her eyes. "Oh, look," Vanessa said loudly, her voice carrying across the nearby tables. "It's Grace again. Following my fiancé around all night, are we?" "I was just delivering drinks, ma'am," Grace said quietly. "Were you?" Vanessa said, standing, swaying slightly from the champagne. "Or were you hoping he'd notice you? Hoping a rich man might feel sorry for a poor little maid?" The nearby tables had gone quiet, sensing a scene. "Vanessa," Nathaniel said low and warning. "That's enough." "No," Vanessa said, her voice rising, cruel and bright, performing now for the crowd that had begun to gather. "It's not enough. I want everyone here to understand something." She grabbed a glass of red wine off Grace's tray, holding it up like a trophy. "People like her," she gestured at Grace with contempt, "exist to serve people like us. That's not an insult. That's just the truth. Some people are born to lead, and some are born to carry the trays." The crowd murmured, some uncomfortable, a few even chuckling nervously, unsure whether this was a joke. Grace stood frozen, humiliation crawling up her neck, but she said nothing. She had learned over years of jobs like this that fighting back cost more than it was worth. "Say something," Vanessa demanded, stepping closer, wine glass trembling in her raised hand. "Or is that beneath you too?" "Vanessa, stop this right now," Nathaniel said, standing, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. But it was too late. Vanessa tilted the glass. The wine was still dripping down Grace's shoulders when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She had no idea that call would end Vanessa Whitmore's entire future. Red wine cascaded slowly over Grace's dark hair, down her neck, staining the collar of her pink uniform. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone laughed nervously. Several phones rose to record. Vanessa stood there, glass tilted, chin lifted, savoring the moment like a queen delivering justice. "There," Vanessa said coldly. "Maybe now you'll remember your place." Grace didn't cry. She didn't run. She stood completely still, wine dripping from her chin, her dignity somehow more visible in that stillness than Vanessa's cruelty was in her cruelty. And then, from her apron pocket, her phone rang. It was Walter Hayes, the family attorney Eleanor had summoned. Grace, hands trembling but steady enough, reached back and answered. "Hello, Miss Bennett," Walter said gently but urgently. "This is Walter Hayes, attorney for the Carrington family. Mrs. Eleanor Carrington asked me to reach you immediately. Is your father's name Arthur Bennett? Did he once work at Carrington and Bennett Hospitality Partners in the early 1990s? Grace's breath caught. "Yes," she whispered. "How do you know that?" "Because," Walter said, "your father co-founded this hotel empire alongside Richard Carrington's father. And under a partnership agreement drafted in 1991, when your family was never properly informed still existed after your father's falling out with the Carringtons, you are legally entitled to 20% ownership of Carrington Hotel Group. We have spent 11 years trying to locate Arthur Bennett's heirs. Miss Bennett, you are one of the wealthiest women in this state, and you didn't even know it." Grace's knees nearly buckled. The tray in her other hand clattered to the marble floor, glasses shattering. "Tell him it's confirmed," Grace said into the phone, her voice shaking, not with fear this time, but disbelief. "Please, tell Mrs. Carrington it's confirmed." The ballroom had gone dead silent. Everyone staring at the strange, wine-soaked woman on the phone, sensing something enormous was unfolding but not understanding what. Eleanor Carrington, from her wheelchair near the back, closed her eyes and pressed a hand to her chest, tears finally falling freely. 40 years of guilt over a partnership her late husband had unjustly frozen out, over a promise broken, over a family abandoned, was finally being set right. Nathaniel stared at Grace, stunned, pieces clicking together in his mind. The forbidden name at dinner. The falling out nobody discussed. His grandmother's tears earlier that night. "Grace," he said slowly, stepping toward her, ignoring Vanessa entirely now. "What did he just say?" Grace looked up at him, wine still dripping down her face, mascara smudged, hands shaking. "My father," she said, voice breaking, "was Arthur Bennett. He co-founded this company, and apparently, I own part of it." The room erupted into stunned whispers. Vanessa's face drained of all color, the empty wine glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor beside Grace's broken tray. What would you do if you were in her place? Vanessa Whitmore had spent her whole life believing money made her untouchable. She was about to learn that humiliating the wrong person could cost her everything. The ballroom that had been filled with laughter and champagne now buzzed with something far more electric. Scandal. Whispers rippled from table to table faster than any waiter could carry a tray. Phones that had been recording Vanessa's cruelty for entertainment now captured her humiliation instead, and social media would make sure neither moment was ever forgotten. Eleanor Carrington was wheeled forward by Walter Hayes, her frail hand reaching out for Grace's own. "My dear girl," Eleanor said, voice trembling with decades of unspoken guilt. "I am so sorry. So very sorry. Your father was one of the finest men I ever knew. My husband, may God forgive him, pushed him out of this company when a merger nearly went wrong, and rather than take responsibility, he blamed Arthur and drove him out with nothing. We searched for years to make it right after my husband passed, but by then, your father had already." She stopped, swallowing hard. We should have found you sooner. I am so deeply sorry. Grace, still trembling, still stained with wine, felt tears finally break free, not from humiliation this time, but from years of grief and struggle suddenly given context. My grandmother used to tell me stories, she whispered. I never believed her. Believe her now, Eleanor said gently. Your father built half of what stands in this room tonight. Nathaniel stepped forward, removing his own suit jacket and draping it gently over Grace's wine-soaked shoulders, a small act of decency that suddenly felt enormous in front of 300 witnesses. I am so sorry, he said quietly, just for her. For all of it. Tonight, and every night you've had to endure people like... He stopped himself, glancing at Vanessa, unable to finish the sentence. Vanessa, humiliated and cornered, tried to recover the only way she knew how, with more arrogance. This doesn't change anything, she said loudly, though her voice cracked with panic. So, her father had some old business deal. That doesn't make her one of us. She's still just a maid who happened to get lucky. The crowd's reaction was immediate, a wave of disgusted murmurs, disapproving stares, a few guests already turning their backs on her entirely. Bridget, her closest friend all evening, quietly stepped away from her side, unwilling to be photographed near her any longer. Vanessa, Marcus Whitmore said sharply, gripping his daughter's arm, his own social standing suddenly at risk. Enough. You've said enough tonight. But Nathaniel had heard enough too, not just tonight, but for months. The dismissive comments about waitstaff, the cruelty toward his own household employees that he'd excused as just Vanessa being particular. The comment 3 weeks ago about his college roommate, who'd grown up working class, not being the right kind of friend for someone in our position. He had ignored so many warning signs, telling himself love meant overlooking flaws. This wasn't a flaw. This was who she was. Vanessa, Nathaniel said, quiet but final. I think we need to talk. Alone. They stepped away from the crowd, into a side hallway near the kitchen, the very hallway Grace had cried in hours earlier. You humiliated an innocent woman tonight, Nathaniel said, in front of everyone we know, because you decided she wasn't worth basic human decency. And the terrifying part, Vanessa, is that you didn't even hesitate. That wasn't a slip. That was who you are when you think there's no consequence. She's staff, Nathaniel. Vanessa hissed, some of her old confidence returning now that they were alone. You're being ridiculous. So she has money now, so what? That doesn't erase what she is. What she is, Nathaniel said slowly, is someone who worked 12-hour shifts to survive while you inherited everything and still found room to look down on people. What she is someone with more grace under humiliation tonight than you've shown in the 2 years I've known you. Vanessa's eyes went wide with disbelief. Are you seriously choosing her a maid over me? I'm not choosing her, Nathaniel said. I'm choosing not to marry someone who treats human worth like a bank statement. I should have seen this a long time ago. He slid the engagement ring, a 3-carat diamond Vanessa had chosen herself 6 months earlier, off his finger's memory, though it had never been his to wear, and instead simply held out his hand, palm up. The ring, Vanessa. Vanessa stared at him, mouth open, the reality of her collapsing world finally catching up to her. You'll regret this, she whispered, voice shaking now, not with cruelty, but with fear. My family will destroy your reputation. Everyone will know. Everyone already knows, Nathaniel said quietly, nodding toward the ballroom, where phones were still recording, where the story was already spreading online in real time. You did that yourself, tonight, in front of everyone. Slowly, hands trembling, Vanessa removed the ring and placed it in his palm. Then she walked out of the gala alone, her father trailing behind her, offering hollow apologies to guests who no longer wanted to hear them, her engagement, her reputation, and the life she'd always assumed was permanent, unraveling in real time behind her. Back in the ballroom, Grace sat wrapped in Nathaniel's jacket, surrounded by Eleanor, Walter Hayes, and a growing sense that her entire life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. 6 months later, the woman who was humiliated in front of 300 guests would stand in that same ballroom again, but this time, everyone would rise when she walked in. The weeks following the gala moved like a storm Grace could barely keep up with. Lawyers, paperwork, board meetings, financial disclosures. The machinery of a hidden inheritance finally reactivating after 11 dormant years. Walter Hayes walked her through everything patiently, treating her not as an outsider, but as the rightful heir she was. Her 20% stake in Carrington Hotel Group was worth, after final valuation, just under $140 million. Grace nearly fainted when she heard the number. But money, she quickly learned, wasn't the part that healed her. What healed her was watching her grandmother, Ruth Bennett, weep with joy in her nursing home room when Grace told her the truth, that Arthur Bennett hadn't failed his family after all, that he'd simply been wronged by powerful people who thought poor men had no recourse. He always said, Ruth whispered, holding Grace's hands, that one day, the truth would find its way home. I just didn't think I'd live to see it. Grace moved her grandmother into a beautiful assisted living facility with round-the-clock care, paid off every medical bill that had haunted her for years, and quietly, without publicity, established a scholarship fund for children of hospitality workers, young people just like she once was, working impossible hours for impossible dreams. Nathaniel, meanwhile, spent those months rebuilding, not his fortune, which had never been at risk, but his understanding of what mattered. He ended his public relationship with the Whitmore family entirely, watched as Marcus Whitmore's business associates quietly distanced themselves once the viral video of the gala reached 200 million views, and watched Vanessa disappear from the social pages that once celebrated her, replaced eventually by whispered gossip about a family fallen from grace. He and Grace remained close through the company transition, not because a fairy tale romance conveniently reappeared to wrap the story in a bow, but because something real and slow began growing between two people who had both, in different ways, been humbled by the same painful night. Grace didn't fall for Nathaniel because he was rich. She'd learned better than that. She grew close to him because he showed up at board meetings at her grandmother's care facility, at the modest scholarship gala she organized for hospitality workers 6 months later, not as the heir to an empire, but as a man trying imperfectly to be better than the family history he'd inherited. At that scholarship gala, held in the very same Carrington Grand Ballroom where Grace had once been humiliated, something remarkable happened. As Grace walked in, no longer in a pink uniform, but in a modest navy dress she'd chosen herself, refusing the designer gowns her new wealth could easily afford, every guest in that room rose to their feet in applause. Eleanor Carrington, now walking with a cane instead of confined to a wheelchair, her health somehow improved by the lifting of decades of guilt, stood at the podium beside her. 11 years ago, Eleanor said to the crowd, my family made a mistake that cost a good man everything. Tonight, we don't just correct that mistake. We honor it by making sure no other family, no other child has to fight as hard as Grace Bennett did just to be seen as human. Grace stepped to the microphone, hands steadier now than they'd ever been. 6 months ago, she said, I was humiliated in this very room for the crime of being poor. I want you to know I don't stand here tonight for revenge. I stand here because somebody somewhere needs to hear this. Your worth was never determined by your bank account. Not then, not now, not ever. Kindness costs nothing. Cruelty costs everything, eventually. I learned that firsthand. The applause that followed lasted nearly a full minute. As for Vanessa Whitmore, she resurfaced only once, months later, in a brief and humbling public statement, admitting that the way she'd been raised had blinded her to basic human decency, and that she was in therapy trying to understand why she'd believed, for 28 years, that some people simply mattered less than others. Whether she truly changed, only time would tell. But for the first time in her life, She understood what it felt like to lose everything because of who you chose to be. Grace Bennet, meanwhile, used her inheritance to build something her father never got the chance to finish, a hospitality company that trained and promoted workers from the very bottom, guaranteeing that no maid, no waiter, no cleaning staff member would ever again be told they didn't belong in the room they'd worked so hard to fill. The truth had finally found its way home, and this time it stayed. True worth was never about money, family names, or social status. It's about how you treat people who can offer you nothing in return. Kindness is free. Respect is free. And in the end, character always outlasts cruelty. If this story touched your heart tonight, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one, and drop a comment below telling us what you would have done in Grace's place. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that kindness always matters more than money. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.